Chapter 41. The battle begins. A chill wind seemed to be coming from somewhere. Race wasn't sure if it was real or simply anticipation of the coming battle. He had fought in battles before, but never before had he felt so worried or so desperate. Not even when he and the Harpies of the Hope had been sent against the walls of the Moth Castle had he felt so afraid. Gagara stood close by him, and she seemed keen to get into battle. Maybe that was what was bothering him. Race looked about the army gathered on the slope of the hill. By normal measures it was actually quite impressively large, yet they were still greatly outnumbered by the elves. Eventually his eyes settled on the king himself. Now it was just a matter of time and waiting for the king to give the order to advance. The king was busy looking about himself. To Race it seemed that the king was making one final check of everything, making sure that everything and everyone was in their rightful places. For a moment he seemed to be quite animated, leaning forward in his saddle so that he could see around the leader, and then leaning back to see the other side of his army around the personage of his queen. Jenny and Mangloss had retaken their places at the front of the army, Jenny's eyes glued to her husband. Clearly she too was waiting for the order. Race felt that she was almost as eager as Gagara, perhaps a little too eager. She was holding the reins of her horse in her left hand, her sword already unsheathed and ready for use in her right. By contrast, Mangloss's head was dipped, apparently uninterested in anything that was going on around him. If anything, he seemed to be dozing lightly in the saddle of his horse. The king took one final look around his army, and for a fraction of a second Race felt as if the monarch was looking right at him. Then he gave his command. "Forwards! We want to advance towards the enemy at walking pace. We don't want our knights or our cavalry to get too far ahead of the rest of the army." King Goti then coaxed his horse to start moving. Slowly, like the brain of a gigantic dinosaur that had just woken up, the army began to move. The front ranks moved immediately, while those at the rear had to wait until there was enough room for them to follow. The sky immediately above the army was soon filled with the beating wings of many thousands of harpies. They kept to the same pace as the human army, flying at what was for them a very leisurely pace. Race was glad to see that the harpies of his village seemed to be mingling easily with the others. It was hard to get the harpies of different villages to cooperate with each other, but the elves had managed it, and now it seemed that Libna had also managed it. She had to be a marvel of a diplomat. Each harpy from Race's village had been given a leather skirt bearing the king's colours. They matched those worn by the others. Race's own skirt had fitted him like a glove. It could almost have been made specially for him. "You shouldn't be with us, my chief," Quinnigoth commented suddenly. "What?" Race replied, a little surprised. All three of Race's bodyguards had flown ahead of their chief, as in the past, creating a kind of shield of harpy flesh between the enemy and their ward. If necessary, they would use their own bodies to intercept arrows that might otherwise hit him. "You should have stayed back at the village, boss," Tanegi said. "When we get into battle, it will be hard for us to concentrate on watching you while trying to fend off the enemy." "It's necessary for the goddess to be with us." It was Libna who spoke. Libna flew a little behind Race, but she was evidently close enough to hear what was being said. "She inspires those who fight with her." "Pah!" Quinnigoth voiced. "No one asked you." "She makes sense, though," Gagara offered. Gagara was flying in her usual position at Race's side. Occasionally, the two of them would exchange meaningful glances. Ideally, Race would have preferred it if Gagara had kept out of this fight, but he daren't suggest it to her again. For one thing, she would likely get angry with him for just mentioning it. For another, of the two of them, he was the one that really shouldn't have been there, despite whatever Libna might have claimed. Slowly, the king's army descended the slope. Between the foot of the slope and the huge pit that used to be the city was an area of scrubland intermingled with a light forest. The army was able to navigate the forest easily, while the harpies kept pace, flying at treetop height. "Perhaps we should gain some altitude," Gagara suggested. "Why?" Libna asked. "So we can rain arrows down on the elves while keeping out of range of their bows," Gagara pointed out. "Our first target has to be the enemy harpies," Libna explained. "We need to match them height for height. If we can clear the skies of all enemy harpies, then we can take our time with the elves." The army passed unhindered through the light forest. They closed the distance between themselves and the elves with every passing second. Arlis might be the largest island in the chain, but it still wasn't a big island. And soon they had closed the gap with the still gathering elven army to a mere 1,000 yards. The king signalled the army to stop. The two armies were very close now. The adversaries peered at each other across an open field, with little more than a few tufts of grass spread over a wide area of long-cooled lava. Gagara took a perch in one of the trees near the front of the army. Race landed on an adjacent branch. He looked at her with a gentle smile, then began studying the enemy lines. The elven front line looked quite organised. The elves stood in neat rows and had made a defensive barrier with their spearmen. Behind the front lines, though, there seemed to be a certain amount of chaos, as the soldiers were quickly trying to arrange themselves into ranks. In the sky above the elven army were the harpies that were loyal to the elves. First, there were the huntresses, all of them armed with bows, and as eager to fight as the girls who were there with Race. Then there were the others, the old escorting the young. Some of the young had to be carried. They fled from the villages that had settled on the side of the pit that was nearest the king's army. They fled across the pit to the far side. "Will that spell you cast on our archers still be effective?" the king asked Manglos. "The spell is good for about an hour," Manglos replied. "Has it been an hour?" "It must be getting close," Jenny piped in. "Might be worth a try anyway." The king nodded. He looked to one of his runners and commanded, "Get back to the archers, tell their officers to target the enemy's front lines." "My liege," the runner replied, and he set off on his task, running as fast as his legs would carry him. "Manglos and I could renew the spell," Jenny suggested, "rather than tipping our hand." "Too late," the king replied. "I doubt we'll get many shots in anyway." When he glanced up towards the harpies, "Race?" "Yes, my liege," Race called from his perch. "You need to get down from there. Get your girls out of the air. The archers are about to fire on the enemy lines. You and your girls are currently in the way." "I understand," Race said. He turned towards Libna. "You heard that?" "I heard that," Libna agreed. And then she yelled at the top of her lungs, "Everyone, get out of the sky. Pass the word on. Get out of the sky." To the humans of the army, it must have sounded as if the sky above them had suddenly erupted into a loud cacophony as the message to get out of the sky was repeated several times. Race didn't hang about. He left his perch and flew over to the king's side, landing next to him. Gagara landed next to Race, while his 3 bodyguards took their usual places behind him. Libna also landed nearby. Soon, the sky above the heads of the king's army was clear of harpies. Some of the harpies had to fly a short distance to find a suitable place to land. It was as if the entire flock had split itself into 2, with most of them gathered on either the left flank or the right flank, while only a few landed in front or behind. With the sky clear, the king's archers fired. Their arrows climbed well beyond the normal range for the bows the humans used. When the arrows descended, many of them hit short, but many more struck in hard among the front ranks of the elves. Some of the arrows even hit a few of the enemy's harpies, tearing them out of the sky. With the king's knights between them and the enemy, only a few of the king's army were actually able to see the result of that first volley of arrows. Nevertheless, the entire army let out a cheer. The archers fired again. Once more their arrows arched majestically across the sky, covering a lot more distance than should normally be possible. Once again they struck the front lines of the enemy. Elves collapsed where they stood, and the harpies dropped out of the sky. For the enemy, this second volley of arrows was the breaking point. Rather than staying put and getting shot at a third time, they began to cross the open country between them and the humans, moving as quickly as their legs could carry them. The elves gave out a blood-curdling war cry as they narrowed the gap between the 2 armies. At the speed they were running, it was likely to take the elves no more than 2 minutes to reach the human army. At the speed they were flying, it was likely to take the harpies less than half that time. "Manglos," the king said quickly. Race thought he heard a touch of panic in his voice. "Call off the archers. Let's get our harpies back into the sky." "Harpies, get back into the sky," Race yelled, not waiting for a more direct order. "Archers, stand down," Manglos called, his voice amplified once again. "Okay," the king said. He certainly sounded nervous. He unsheathed his sword. "Let's meet them halfway." "Charge!" The 2 armies charged headlong towards each other. The knights, and what little cavalry they had, pulled ahead of the rest of the army. The king charged towards the middle of the enemy lines, while Greyforth and Manipur aimed their troops at the enemy flanks. It was less than a second before the knights smashed their way into the front of the elven army when the 2 opposing forces of harpies clashed overhead. A few of the harpies used their bows and their dart throwers at what was little more than point-blank range. Most of them, though, had just put away or dropped their ranged weapons and were going at each other with claw and talon. Some of the harpies were so low in the sky, as they thought, that the forces on the ground could have reached up and touched them, had they not had enemies of their own to deal with. Soon, the sky seemed to be raining harpies. Not all those dropping from the sky were dead either. In some cases it was just easier for a huntress to drag her opponent out of the air and finish her on the ground. Any harpy who fell wounded out of the sky and landed in among the opposing side's ground forces could expect no mercy. In a way it seemed as if there were two battles being fought, the one in the air and the one on the ground. The elves proved to be no match for the mounted knights. Soon they were getting cut to ribbons. Occasionally a group of elves would get lucky and would drag a knight from his horse, but the armour the knights wore was so thick that they could only kill such a foe by stabbing him through the visor of his helmet. Some of the knights that were dragged from their horses were able to continue the fight on foot, and the elves soon discovered that a knight on foot was almost as deadly as one on horseback. The peasants were the next to join in the fray. They were unarmoured and armed only with the most fundamental of farming implements. Though it was true that they had received a little bit of training in martial matters, they had only been trained for 4 months. Normally, 1-on-1 against an elven soldier, the odds would be with the elf. However, the morale of the front line of the elven army had been so shattered by the charging knights that the elves were relatively easy pickings even for the peasants. When the men-at-arms also entered the fray, the elves who had led the charge turned and immediately began to flee. "Push them back!" Enid yelled eagerly. Her sword slashed down quickly, cutting her enemies down left and right. "Throw them back into the pit!" Queen Jenny joined in. In the skies overhead, the harpies continued to cut each other to pieces. Race had never tried to fight with a sword in the sky before, and though he was able to get the better of any foe that came near him, he found it awkward and clumsy. He could understand why the average harpy preferred to use her claws and talons in such a situation, and he wished he was as proficient in them as his wife seemed to be. It looked as if the girl was having the time of her life. Whenever Race glanced in her direction, she seemed to be dispatching another opponent. He worried about her, yet she seemed more than capable of dealing with any foe that came near her. Her mother had taught her to fight, and had taught her well. Already in the confusion of the battle, Race lost sight of both Quinagoth and Samigi. With so many harpies falling out of the sky on both sides, he feared the worst. Fortunately, Tanegi was still close by, and he could hear Libna making strange sounds behind him as she dispatched each of her opponents. Up here in the skies above the battlefield, no one seemed to have an advantage over the other. The two factions of harpies were each given as good as they got, and as many harpies wearing skirts fell from the sky as did those without. It seemed strange that the enemy would then suddenly turn tail and flee. The king's harpies gave pursuit. Those who still had a ranged weapon of some kind and arrows to fire shot them into the backs of those who were fleeing. Race felt himself dragged along with the enthusiasm of the others. Could they really be about to win this battle so easily? Race's attention was split between his immediate foes and the battle that was taking place on the ground. The battle between the humans and the elves had also pretty much turned into a rout. Down there the elves were fleeing for their lives. The knights had reached the now deserted harpy villages on this side of the pit, and were riding down their elven foes between the huts. No elf surrendered, no prisoners were taken. Some elves did manage to make it to the pit. When Race had flown over the pit earlier that day, he had seen the walkways that led up the sides to the top. There were many of these walkways, and Race had thought nothing of it at the time. One thing he was sure of, though, was that there was barely enough room on one of them for there to be two abreast. No wonder the elves had brought no horses. The elves that did reach the pit fought with each other to get onto those walkways. Some even went so far as to throw others off the walkways in order to clear the way for them to descend. The soldiers of the king's army followed close behind, eager to press their advantage. Many of the peasants and the men-at-arms started to pour down those same walkways, chasing the fleeing elves. Greyforth rode through one of the harpy villages. The only elves left out of the pit seemed to be the dead and the wounded. He rode casually up to the edge of the pit and peered over the edge. His sword, tinted red with the blood of so many of his enemies, seemed to glisten in the sunlight. Race didn't hear what his brother was saying, but it looked as if he was talking to one of his other knights, probably Sir Gran. Then Greyforth jumped down from the back of his horse and began to lead the knights under his command down the walkways after the enemy. The attack on the pit itself had begun. In the sky above, the enemy harpies continued to fly to the far side of the pit, pursued by those who supported the human king. Most of the lead pursuers had run out of arrows by now, but there were still a few missiles scooting through the air and bringing down the occasional foe. They pursued the enemy beyond the lip of the pit, eager to reach and attack the villages on the far side. Race had never been all that fast a flyer. He had fallen back from the front lines a little. Then, as he too was approaching the lip of the pit, he felt someone grab hold of his leg from behind. Race glanced angrily round to see who it was. It was Libna. What the? Don't lay an egg, sweetie, Libna commented. I smell a trap. We should wait here. A trap? Race asked. Are you sure? We should warn the others. Too late, Libna said. There were at least 1,000 of the king's harpies flying over the pit when Libna uttered those last 2 words. The king's harpies had been so keen on reaching the enemy that they hadn't taken into account just how low they were, or that the elves would have archers in the pit just waiting for them. The elven archers fired. The sky above the pit was raining dead harpies. This time every one of the fallen was wearing a skirt that proclaimed her loyal to the king. Gagara! Race yelled worriedly. Yes, handsome, Gagara replied. Race felt his heart miss a beat as he realised Gagara was behind him. She hadn't been among those who had just fallen victims of the trap. They're more your girls than mine. What do you think we should do? Race glanced around at Libna. We should press on with the attack, Libna suggested. We should climb higher, get above the range of the elven archers and hit the enemy hard before they have a chance to recover properly. Race nodded. That sounds like a plan, but it might be nasty if the elven mages enhanced the range of their archers. Maybe it'd be better if we skirted around the pit instead. You're the boss, Libna said. Race turned his attention back to Gagara. For one nasty moment he had thought he'd lost her. He wasn't sure he was willing to see her put herself at risk any further. Gagara, sweetie, I think it might be an idea if you were to stick close to the king and my sister for the rest of the battle. What? Gagara sounded quite indignant. And miss out on all the fun? But, Race said. He froze for a moment and then he said, I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose you either, Gagara replied, rewarding him with a cute smile. I have an idea, Tanegi suggested. Why don't we all go and join the king and queen? I'm sure Libna can press home the attack. Gagara sounded a little grumpy as she spoke. I suppose if my husband were with me, I'd be willing to set out in the next part of the battle. Race glanced quickly at Gagara, Libna and Tanegi in turn. Then he commented, I don't like it. I feel as if I should be in the thick of it. Then I'm coming with you, Gagara insisted. Look, Libna said simply, I'll pass on your orders to some of the girls to press home the attack without us. I have a proposal to put to your king anyway. I think I'd prefer it if you were there. A proposal? Race asked. You'll hear it when I talk to the king, Libna remarked. Just give me a minute first to pass on your orders. It actually took less than a minute. Libna gave her orders to one of the nearest harpies, and those within hearing distance passed the message on to those nearest them. Shortly the entire flock began to split into 2 roughly equal parts, and then they began to skirt around the edges of the pit. Race, Gagara, Tanegi and Libna had begun to search for any sign of either King Goti or his wife when the elven inquisitors made their presence known. Race had seen how many mages there were in the pit. He knew there were at least 10 regiments of them, and he knew that some of them were likely to be extremely powerful. At first the mages seemed to be producing nothing more than a strange light show. Beams of light struck the edges of the pit. The area was suddenly lit up brighter than a hot summer's day. Then Race was privy to the sight of 2 knights standing at the edge of the pit waiting to join the others fighting on the walkways. When one of those beams of light swept across the 2 knights, they suddenly ceased to exist. Other knights began to appear at the top of the pit. By the look of it, they were fleeing, and the one in front managed to get a single step beyond the pit before another beam of light hit him, and he, like the others, vanished. It was then that Race caught sight of Jenny, though it was more the shrill sound of her voice in all the commotion, as she screamed out in worried consternation over her brother, No! Horse and Tiger, no! Greyfolf!